Well, thanks for making the time.
Great to be here.
I really enjoyed the conversation we had last year, which was only audio. So I thought maybe it would make it a little bit more interactive with video.
That'd be great. Although maybe you want to stick just with the audio, but that's fine.
And I figured the conversation from last year was really about talking about how can you build alternative governance models. And I think if you look back at the past year and what happened in geopolitics around the world, I mean, it's quite alarming. Today, I read somewhere that the CIA issued a statement saying that the U.S. is not going to attack, but like, who knows? It's still a risk, I think, for sure. And so I think what the world needs is sort of ways to build alternative models, to sort of like challenge that power, because it seems like out of hand. And in many ways, the U.S. is like a democracy that doesn't really function properly. And so I'm just curious to hear your thoughts. You mentioned the initiative, so we can just kick off there.
Sure. The general premise behind what we've created, what's called the Fast Track Institute, is two things. One is that all of our existing leadership are not set up for the world that's coming. All of our leaders globally are set up to manage a predictable, linear, status quo, incremental world, and we're coming into like Black Swan Central. And so that's one massive challenge. The second is, as we see companies spinning out to try and address this new world, like Matternet that's trying to do drones or new medical discoveries, they all hit the regulatory governance barrier. The FAA's first response to a drone was ban all drones because somebody might do something bad with it. And then slowly open that tap, and it takes like 20 years for society to get the benefit of the technology. And so we've been thinking about ways of how do you short circuit that. And so that's kind of what we're trying to do. And how do you now do two things? One is short circuit the time lag of acceptance and deployment of new technologies. And the second is, what are the new governance models that are going forward? And so those are the areas that we've been looking at. And what we decided to do was to experiment with what we call the Fast Track Institute. And what I've been doing since this book I wrote came out 2-3 years ago on how to organize for the future is I've solved the immune system problem in big companies. So we can go into a large organization and run a 10-week process that solves their immune system. We've run it with Procter & Gamble and a bunch of other companies 7 times now. And we've kind of cracked that model. Then we said, okay, let's apply that to public sector. Because in the public sector, the existing policy is the immune system. You try and update education and the teachers' unions fight you. And you're in a kind of a Swiss cheese nightmare around that. And so what we did was we worked with the mayor of Medellin in Colombia, who's actually here, by the way, and their team, and said, let's pick 4 problems facing the city and let's run that same type of a sprint approach on a city level to solve specific issues: corruption, healthcare, education, mobility, the 4 issues. And what we found was we can solve a problem facing a city for about 1/10 of the current cost. Because new technologies are so much dramatically cheaper. And the way we crack it is that while we're looking at a technology like, hey, can we use drones for commercial goods and take a lot of trucks off the street, we're also looking at what airspace regulations, legal changes, policy changes need to be made while we're evaluating the technology, so that we hit the ground running on the other side. And so literally what broke this week is after doing that 3 cycles in Medellin, we've just started this week a process with the mayor of Miami to solve transportation. So we're going to run a 4-month sprint to figure out what should the future look like in transportation. And what's interesting is if you're Miami and you solve that problem, those solutions are exportable to every major city in the world. And so that's the way we're looking at it. But your earlier comment is absolutely dead on. We have probably the biggest leadership crisis in the world that we've ever had today, because we've got massive new technologies that are billions of times more powerful than what we had before, and a global leadership that is not set up to navigate this at all. Right? I look at the rise of fundamentalism globally, and you see this. Every pockets of people in every ideology are saying, hey, we can't take this pace of change. Let's go back to an older time when things were better. And it's a fallacy, if you listen to Peter at all, but the motivation is there, and it's headed in the wrong direction. Right? Whether it's Hindu nationalists in India or Jewish settlers or Christian radicals, evangelicals, Muslim radicals. And essentially we have a leadership failure because our leaders are not able to articulate the magical future that's coming. And that's why we set up Singularity, was to, let's educate the world's leaders on how to do this. So that kind of we've started to get to, but now we're thinking about a lot more on what are the mechanisms, the next layer down, and what does the deployment look like.
Yeah, I think it's so difficult because the world that we're entering is virtual in so many ways, and
Yeah.
there's no new land to go, and then people like see sort of the new world that exists, right?
Right.
And in all the existing countries, all the land's basically taken up. There's this place in Eastern Europe called Liberland, but it doesn't seem like there's no critical mass behind any of these projects yet.
Right.
And so, like, where do you see the possibility of countries, especially in the U.S.? I mean, it's pretty sad that if you look at developments in the U.S. Towards immigration and towards so many important issues, they're really lacking behind blockchain, especially, which is like they're going to be the fundamental technology behind sort of this new internet. And it's pretty sad development, and I'm still hopeful because we can change it, right? I mean, there's still like so many smart people in the U.S., but maybe the incentive structure or
It's actually, I think there's two levels of issues. One is actually three levels of issue. Okay, number one, we're organized globally at the nation state level. And nations which had enough critical mass of multiple industries and abundance of natural resources, etc. We're migrating much more to the city level, which is why we focus our work in cities. I mean, you look at every major country in the world today, it's a mess. Right? India, China, Russia, Brazil, all a mess. We think that all the advantage in the future goes to the smaller countries because flexibility and adaptability trump
more decentralized.
Scale. Yeah. And so we look at that in organizations in the same way, and we get to see the biggest globalized companies are all in deep trouble in the same way. And so if you kind of push that thesis down, then really where the future looks is cities. And one of our faculty said something profound to me. He said, look, if you want to solve the grand challenges, you have to do it in cities.
But the problem is cities don't have sovereignty, right? Cities are still they're still under the
Agreed.
system.
And that's what we're figuring out how to break through from. But increasingly, though, you look at the city and the mayors in the U.S. fighting back against Trump, right? Or the prominence of London or Paris. And what you see, this whole Brexit, Trump, all of the stuff that's happening, it's not really left versus right. It's really rural versus urban. Because we've spent so much time focusing, all the media, all the narratives, all the cultural stories are all about cities. The rest of the countries, or parts of each country, are left behind, and this is essentially the revolt. We're seeing the Luddite revolt, basically. People are saying, let's go back to an older time. Maybe the biggest insight I've ever had from all of this is that people would much rather be comfortable than happy. And they're comfortable in the way, the patterns that they knew that their parents and their grandparents grew up in. It doesn't make them any happier, but they're more comfortable with it. And so we have to figure out how to transcend that and bring them along in much more interesting ways. And I think one way we'll do it is as we deploy technology to make transportation easier, it'll become easier. Just as an example, if I think about one of the predictions we've made is, as you have autonomous cars, the traffic capacity of existing roads increases between 10 to 15 times. Okay? Now we have real estate, massive real estate spikes in the middle of big cities globally because it's so hard to get in and out. Well, when it's 10 times easier to get in and out of the city, real estate really flattened. And now it's way easier to live for and could be.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of silly how everyone goes to the same places like San Francisco, New York. I mean, it's
exactly.
In a world that's going to become more and more decentralized, it's not really necessary. And like, there's so much land, and then everyone comes to the same spot in a way,
right?
Which is not very feasible for so many reasons.
And we're seeing now the rise of new pockets of places that we're seeing complete gatherings of humanity in completely unexpected ways, like Burning Man. Right? Or the maker movement, or the open source movement. I think we'll see completely new means, and I think your comment earlier about as we live in this virtual world, we can operate in that basis on a much more interesting way. Right? The CEO of our company right now is sitting in frickin' Bali, writing a book and having meetings, etc. He's sitting in Bali. We're jealous. Why does he get to do it? We don't. But this is what's possible today. And I think but that hasn't translated or kind of entered into any of the realms of political life. I think we talked last year about it. We still vote on a geographic basis.
Yeah.
I mean,
the identity, the national identity is still very embedded. You can look in Europe. You can see that with all these like soccer clubs, right? People really cheering for their team, and so people want to identify with something. The problem is, I think, everyone is attached to all these old identities.
Yeah.
And we need to create new identities, and it's the world where we're creating is so elusive, right? Because it's all like in AI and virtual worlds, and explaining that it's.
I mean, the tragedy is right now we're taking the current tribal clan type structures we've grown up with for thousands of years and moving them online, right? We have Facebook groups. For the way I think about that is that, like, when we first went from radio to TV, they had literally radio announcers reading the scripts on air because they hadn't figured out what the medium could do.
Right.
And in the same way, we've moved our offline tribal instincts and gatherings and family systems, etc., move them onto the internet, where you thumb things and you like things and you create groups, etc., based on that. But at some point, we'll need to transcend that.
Yeah,
I'm hoping it's a generational thing. I'm hoping the next generation, the younger generation, operates in a different way. We're seeing that happen, but it's a painfully slow process.
But I mean, the fundamental problem is that we have essentially an old order that has no incentive to change the current structure, right?
Yeah.
And so I think this whole world of that is really fundamentally driven by the elite.
Yeah.
But more and more now we see value doesn't come from the elite. It goes there and then stays there in some ways. Right?
Agreed.
And so I think this whole idea of hierarchies versus networks.
Yeah.
Networks becoming more powerful, networks gaining more sovereignty. That's something that's so exciting to me, and I feel like we don't have to wait for Elon Musk to get us to Mars. We can build places like that here already.
I'm actually more optimistic than you may be on this, because I think what will happen is you have the old versus new in this tension, and what will happen is that tension at some point will break, and we'll move very quickly to the new, because we can't go back to the old. Either that, or we kind of have existential threat and we do something.
But I think because
right?
it's not.
So we either have one or the other. We either have massive, World War III type stupidity, which is certainly feasible, or we very rapidly go to this new model.
But see, that I want to see this happening.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it's not like software where you can just update, or like a Tesla. Okay, let's switch to a better car, right? It involves at the end of the day, how do we govern ourselves, and how do we do that? And so.
This is Socrates, right? What was it, part 382b of thing where he says, these are important matters. How do we choose to conduct ourselves? This is essentially the question we're dealing with today. I think, but the reason I say I'm more optimistic is we have a forcing function in technology. What is happening because of accelerating technologies and exponential technologies is inexorable. Solar energy is going to take over the world, whether you like it or not. And no amount of fossil fuel heaven will kind of keep you where they were. And that's actually a good thing. And I think the geopolitical implications of that are very profound. Right? I'm fascinated by the idea that the poorest countries in the world are the sunniest countries in the world. So you upend that order right away, right there. Right? And we talk to security agencies around who are worried about big power systems as points of attack for terrorism. Well, once you have a decentralized grid, that goes out of the window as well. And so the world becomes way more easily done. The question is, how the hell do we manage that transition? I think that's the real question.
That's
you're
the key,
asking.
right?
Yeah. And so we're trying to address that. We're trying to say, okay, let's create these new governance models at the city level, and then replicate them across cities, and then let them roll up to the federal. The problem with the federal is because it's top down, it takes too long. If you have to bring the whole population along to think about, drones rights or robot rights, right? You'll just never get there in a world where there's so many disparate and the political spectrum is so broad. But at a very local level, you can implement them. People will see the value. You get empirical data. The economic benefit will be there, and it'll ripple up very, very quickly. I'll give you a small example that I think maybe will bring this home. In 2010, I had Brad Templeton on stage talking about the future of autonomous cars. I said, hey, when will we have the first authenticated, licensed autonomous car on the streets? And he said, well, the car is ready, because you don't need human intelligence, you need horse intelligence, and we have that. But the regulatory, the insurance, the legal, all of that crap, it'll take years. He figured 2018 before you'd have the first authorized car on the street. So we're looking at that going, yeah, that seems reasonable. And then to everybody's surprise, in 2012, Nevada authorized autonomous cars, right? Even then we thought, okay, it's Nevada, they'll authorize anything in Nevada, so that doesn't really count. But then Florida, because of all the senior citizens, and then 8 states now have it on the books. And what we're finding is we're getting real traction at a city and a state level and a local level saying, listen, and now, interestingly, all autonomous R&D testing happens in Nevada because they authorized it first. And if you can go to cities and say, listen, if you authorize this type of medical procedure or this type of whatever, you'll get all the R&D around that. That gets really interesting very fast. And so I think that will break the systems. The problem is, how do you make it a smooth transition rather than being violent?
But that would that wouldn't enable someone outside the United States to come here, to work here. Like, movement of labor would still be restricted under that model, right? So we're empowering cities in some ways.
It would be.
I'm just playing the devil's advocate.
Sure, but now imagine. So we've been working with the mayor of Medellin in Colombia. Okay. So we run this process a bunch of times. Well, if we have a model where we can train up thousands of new software developers, they don't need to outsource their software development anymore. They can keep all that revenue locally, right? And then they can create local factories in local cities. Singularity is doing a big analysis with the city of Columbus to create a maker labs and maker spaces there. And so what will happen is cities will become self-sufficient, and they'll really become a fully circular economy. Locally sourced foods and locally created products and services.
So we could have city-states.
Essentially.
Again.
Yeah, well, that's where we'll get to. So it turns out to be a much more natural organizing principle than the current nation state, which is only a couple of hundred.
So we should have an
anyway.
increase in countries, essentially.
Yes.
In the future, there should be thousands of countries.
Yeah.
Like cryptocurrency tokens will have currency,
Exactly.
government tokens.
Yeah.
And then people can trade, and you can switch.
And because the information flow is free and seamless, then you can have a large number with no extra cost. And the reason you have nation states is it's too expensive for 10 countries in Europe to have their own, education systems. But now everybody can have their own ones, and it's consistent across the paradigm. It's online anyway, it doesn't matter.
Because one big problem still is that essentially admission into an exclusive network is a most important thing you have to do, right? Like in the U.S., getting into these good schools, or migrating to a rich country, it's really the entry point. That's something that is really difficult.
It was, but now that's starting to break. So let me give you the example of GitHub. Right? GitHub is a platform to do social coding, and I can rate your code, and you can rate my code, and there's a Yelp system. They've employed all of the 11 attributes that we talk about in my Exponential Organizations book. The interesting model around GitHub is now, today in Silicon Valley, if you're a software developer, your salary has no bearing on what university you went to, what degree you got, or what grades you got. It's 100% what is your rating on GitHub, which is an open meritocracy, transparent. And so when we apply that to, say, doctors, and we already do that with restaurants, right? Your Yelp rating drives your revenue. And your Uber rating drives whether you're a good driver or not, pun intended. And so now we'll see new models where we have a kind of a networked model of how things are governed and where you have meritocracy.
That's still true, but still, it's difficult even to get a work permit in the U.S., for example.
Agreed.
Right?
Agreed.
So,
but again,
if you look at the whole refugee crisis.
But if I'm a great developer, I don't need to be in the U.S., right?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I live right now between Miami and Toronto because I have the choice of living anywhere, and it doesn't matter where I'm on. I'm on a plane 90% of the time anyway. That's a different problem. But when we think about the models under which we'll operate, I think what we'll find is there'll be massive economic incentive for creating high bandwidth cities that have really lovely local walking areas that people can collaborate, and then they go do their own thing. So the company that I have, Shay is in Toronto, I've got a COO in Vancouver, my CEO's in Spain, my CFO's in Boston, and we have 20 people, and they're literally, we've met once ever. And we can build everybody lives in their local area. And so you don't really need the city-state or nation-state concept for that. You just need pockets of places where people have fun, and then we can all connect and collaborate.
Yeah. Well, that's in terms of how people organize themselves, right?
Yeah.
But the power still remains. I mean, if you look at the power struggles today with North Korea, that's driven by nation states, right?
It is.
Military power, is attached to nation states.
It is.
And so, but I think you're saying essentially that the biggest evolution can be found within these emerging city-states, right?
Agreed. But I think what's going to happen is, what's going to happen in the U.S. is no matter what Trump tries to do, the cities are going to say, we want to support the climate of the Paris Accord. And whatever the cities decide is going to be national policy just by definition and by the sheer critical mass. And so the presidential diktat on any particular issue now is irrelevant. It's really the cities that decide. In fact, in China, if you talk to people, the mayors run the country. Because they've got local control and accountability, and they need.
So basically, cities are going to be decentralized nodes within a country that will then disrupt the entire system.
Bingo.
And then you'll have political evolution or innovation essentially within those centers.
Right.
And then basically, like Router, they can exchange all this information. And then if one city just finds something that's very interesting, then they can export it to other cities.
Yeah. And that's happening now. We help facilitate that. That's what we call this thing the fast track thing, right? And I'll give you the negative example. 20, 30 years ago, I was living in Montreal, and the state government, the provincial government, decides we're going to have French as the official government of the city, right? Of the language of the province. And a law was passed that you, if in order to work in any profession, you had to learn fluent French in 6 months. Right? Now the poor mayor of Montreal is there going, what the hell did you just do to me? Their economy got decimated. The city shrank by 2/3 in 5 years. Everybody just got up and moved to Toronto. Right now, so what that means, what that instantly did, it just wiped out the power at the provincial level, because people said, you were never making that kind of a stupid mistake again, ever. You're done. And so now all of the cities, so if you look at the big cities we have globally today, Shanghai, Tokyo, Mexico City, Sao Paulo, those are more complex and bigger than any country was 100 years ago. Right? And these are really huge, huge things. There's no country that was that size a few hundred years ago, ever. And so this is a really.
I think it's probably not intuitive to people, because the historical idea is always like, we're moving somewhere else. Like the frontier is somewhere to move to, and it's one place.
That's right.
And I think now it's like going to be decentralized everywhere.
That's right.
But like, let's say you would, you're 20 years old again, and like you have no identity, and everything's stripped away, and you come to this planet. Like, where would you go? Like, where would you immigrate to? Like, is there any place on Earth that you would like?
I mean, there's a few good pockets: Denmark, Canada. If you're going to go really far away, like Fiji or someplace to be as far from everything, or New Zealand.
So you would not come to the U.S.?
I would not come to the U.S. I mean, the U.S. goes backwards for 20 years.
So do you
listen, there was a study done by Princeton 2 years ago that showed that in no way, shape, or form is the U.S. a functioning democracy today. There's no amount of public will that can result in legislation, which means you're not a democracy.
But that could change, no?
No, it won't change. The reason it won't change is because you've got the country so fundamentally split that you can't fix it easily. It's a structural problem. Because now 50-50%. I mean, I had a really sobering chat early on in our Singularity world with George Shultz. He was the former Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense under Reagan and stuff. And I said, look, you've been in politics for decades. How bad is it right now? Is it just a blip, or is this really a big deal, what's happening right now? And this was during the Obama years. And he said, actually, it's way worse than I've ever seen it. I was like, wow, you mean the worse than Vietnam and the McCarthy years? He goes, yeah, because at least then people collaborated across the aisle. You had Republicans, Democrats, and they'd hate the way they party, but they'd get some legislation done and they'd get it done. Now they wouldn't even talk. And when you have a system that completely depends on compromise and collaboration and conversation and discussion, you wouldn't even talk. You're done. You can't fix that. And I said, well, how would you fix it? And he goes, I've been thinking about that for 6 years. I have no idea. And I've never stopped thinking about that conversation, because here's a guy with 40 years of public office experience with absolutely zero idea what to do except just to be stuck in the system. And this is the big challenge we have, and what all of our alumni have, is that we kind of get a sense for what's coming. When they go back to their home countries, what in God's name do you do? Right? It's now, we have quite a few of the 3-4-star generals in the U.S. Marines coming for the one-week course at Singularity. It's great that they get it, but when they go back to Washington, they're back in the machine. You have to change the machine. And you can change it in the existing way. What you have to do is...
It's almost like the evolution from the horse to the car.
You can't...
And people just extrapolate from the horse.
If you're running a stable, you're not the guy you're going to be building a car. It's just... And David Roberts talks about this with his disruptive innovation thinking, and Clay Christensen will talk about that more. The big challenge is you have to do two things. One, you have to suppress the immune system response and the Luddite response, so that they don't attack new ideas. And secondly, you have to radically go with new ideas at the edge of the organization. So if you try and update education today, the teachers' unions fight you, the textbook publishers fight you, the Texas Christian evangelicals fight you if you're in the US, and you get nothing done. What we will see happening, though, our thesis is just ignore the status quo. Create new models at the edge that are very aggressive, like the Khan Academy and the new models that are popping up. And then let society drift to those. Those become the new gravity center. Don't try and fix the status quo. Because you spend all your time fighting that tension, fighting the legacy, fighting legacy thinking, etc.
Yeah, for me, working on in the blockchain and crypto industry, it's very difficult to decide even if I should stay here in the US, because does it really make sense to be here anymore? And then, the US is very
And from
very
a regular,
difficult to deal with.
and from the regulatory perspective, Wall Street has such an, because you've got regulatory capture, right? The rules and the regulations here are not determined by what's best for the people, it's determined by what's best for the institutions and for the status quo. Therefore, nothing will get done. Now you look at Singapore or Switzerland, what they're doing with the new regulations there, that's where the gravity center will go.
But couldn't we build a Singapore inside the United States? Like
No.
a special economic zone?
No.
It's because there's no political will.
Yeah.
But that's very,
You
that's
said
very
it,
bleak outlook for
you
the
said it
US.
earlier, the land is gone. There's no more land to go to. Right? I mean, the libertarians are saying, let's all move to one state, like New Hampshire, and just take over the state and try and do it there. That's one option, but that's, again, painful. You're still stuck in the old thing. If I was, I think one of the most interesting places today is Andorra, a little country between Spain and France. It's not an EU country, right? You could buy it for about $200 million, and you have a country. That's what I do. In fact, here's an idea we could collaborate. Let's do an ICO for forming a completely new country.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Raise enough money,
Yes.
200 million is not that much.
Exactly.
Go buy the place. Or,
Like they
or
raise
something
all so
similar.
much, you know, like
Yeah.
Filecoin is valued now at $2.2 billion. They
Yeah.
raised like, and
And so
yeah.
you go do one of those, go buy a country,
yeah. And then you invite
and then
basically,
you just
basically it's a
redo, it's a
platform,
re-architect.
it's a real platform existing in real life
Yeah.
for like innovative things. It's basically a special economic zone outside the scope of any nation state.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah. Is it?
9 a.m. tomorrow. we'll start.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Great discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks.
Cool.